And now onward to Joshua, a book of triumph, a book of conquering the promised land. After 40 years of slogging it out in the desert and having to deal with scorpions and having to deal with manna for 40 years and all the difficulties of complaining and burying their relatives and their loved ones, now we get to Joshua. And what's going to happen here is we'll see the triumphal possession of Israel in the promised land. Oh, it's about 1380 BC when Joshua was written. This would have been about the time Joshua died. And this book would have been written to be an encouragement to the Jews living at that time to press on in the wake of Joshua's great conquest. But you could put it this way. Moses led Israel out of bondage. Joshua takes them into blessing. Moses took them through the Red Sea. Joshua will take them through the Jordan River, because there will be a miraculous parting of the Jordan River, which itself will serve as a reminder to the older generation that survived the death march of 40 years. They'll get to see a miraculous crossing, having heard the stories about the Red Sea crossing from their forefathers who died in the wilderness. So we're going to triumphantly possess the promised land. Some of the notable passages here in chapter 1, every place your foot treads I have given as a possession. In Joshua 1:6, be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to give to you. Verse 7, only be strong and be courageous. Verse 9, have I not commanded you, be strong. So he's going to have courage. Joshua can't just walk in and tell people to leave. They have to fight a war. It's going to be a 7-year-long war to take the promised land. And it says in Joshua 1:8, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. Meditate on the book of the law. And I'll ask you, what does he mean by the book of the law? Well, it's the Pentateuch. First 5 books of the Bible, which we've already studied. That was their Bible. They had it. And their Bible had 5 books in it. Ours has 39. Theirs had 5 by that point. So they're to be strong, to be obedient. They're sending spies into Jericho. Remember, God sent spies into the promised land 40 years earlier out of Kadesh. Now he's sending spies in again. They're going to go in behind the ark, and they're going to have a triumphal conquest there. And they cross the Jordan River. And God opens the river, and it opens it up for many miles. It's at flood stage, and God opens up the Jordan River. And then in chapter 5, Joshua is kind of thinking about this conquest, kind of wondering how it's going to go. He's on the eve of a battle here. And it says in Joshua 5, verse 13, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? Like IFF code, are you a friend or foe? I don't know who you are. And he says, no, rather I come now as captain of the host of the Lord. And then Joshua worships him, and basically what happens is he's having an encounter with Jesus Christ. That would be a pre-incarnate Christ. We call it a Christophany in the Old Testament, because worship happens, they're standing on holy ground, and all this kind of thing. So Joshua is ready, and Jericho is going to fall. They march around Jericho several times for about a week, and then the walls fall down. You can read that story. But then they're 1-0. So now let's go fight against Ai. The little village of Ai will have the same success. But they didn't. 36 Jews died in that battle, and they're wondering what happened and what went wrong. Well, what went wrong is a guy named Achan was covetous. Achan kept some of the wealth and the ritzy things out of Jericho, which he was supposed to destroy. He kept it for himself, hid it in his tent. So then Achan gets stoned to death and killed as an example of the others. You got to obey God. Be courageous, but meditate on the Word of God. Obey the Word of God. Don't come up with your own ideas. So Achan really paid the price there. So Joshua starts conquering the land, and if I can do it physically, he did a central campaign, and then he did a southern campaign, and then he went way up north to Hatzor and burned that city. We got archaeologists today. For decades they've been excavating at Hatzor, and they found the Joshua burn layer. It's there. He burned that city. But at part of his battle, what's interesting is it's called Joshua's longest day in chapter 10. He's got a day where the slaughter is going so good and God's sending down hailstones to kill the enemy. And Joshua then finds out, he prays to God, and God says, I'm going to have the sun stand still. It's going to stay at high noon for a whole day before it sets. And it's just the miracle of God that he provided this long day. And so he conquers the promised land. Probably the downside of Joshua, besides Achan, and besides the Gibeonites who deceived Joshua. You'd have to read about the deception of the Gibeonites and find out how they tricked Joshua, and Joshua didn't consult the Lord, signed a covenant. He never should have done it. It was not a very good deal. But mainly things went very well, except it says in chapter 13, verse 1, there remained yet very much land to be possessed, which means Joshua conquered the land, but he didn't completely cleanse it of the evil inhabitants. That's going to be a problem and lead to 325 years of Judges. That's why Judges is so up and down, because Joshua didn't finish the conquest. He died and left no strong leader in place behind him. So Joshua has the long day. At the end of the book, he exhorts the 2.5 tribes, because, Reuben, Gad, and half Manasseh, they're going to move over to the east side of the Jordan, and the rest will be on the west side of the Jordan. He's going to exhort the people. And then in chapter 24, as I mentioned earlier, choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And with that, Joshua dies. Now, with the death of Joshua comes the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, I call it rising and falling, rising and falling. There's 7 cycles in Judges. 7 times where if I was drawing it on a board, they're doing well, then they sink into sin, and then they are in servitude, then they pray, and they come up, and then God raises up a judge, and they have a good for a while, and then they fall into sin, and they go down. There's 7 times they go through this cycle of sin, servitude, supplication, and salvation. They sin, they fall into the possession or servitude of a foreign king, and then they decide to pray, that's supplication, and then God raises up another judge. And something I always think of Judges as is it's the day of small things. The Jews didn't have the Israeli Uzis. They didn't have tanks. They didn't have the big weapons. They had very little to fight with to try to continue possessing the promised land that Joshua had started. For example, there's a story of Ehud with his bloody dagger. Okay, Ehud was a left-handed guy like me, and he made an 18-inch blade, and he went in to pay the tribute to this King Eglon, this grossly obese, morbidly obese man. And he walks into Eglon, who's the enemy. He says, I have a message from the Lord for you. And he took his dagger, he pulled it out from seclusion under his robe, and he jammed it into Eglon. And it went in so far, the handle stayed inside him. The whole blade and handle disappeared inside this man, and Eglon died. That's all Ehud had, was a bloody dagger. There's another story about a woman named Jael who killed this fleeing general with a tent peg. I don't know if you've ever read the tent peg story, but Sisera, I call him Sisera the sissy, because he was in his chariot, he got stuck in the mud, and then instead of fighting the Jews, he ran off and hid in the tent of a woman named Jael, or Yael in the Hebrew. And he says, hey, hide me, I've got people pursuing me, I want to hide in the tent, and I need a glass of water, I'm thirsty. She gives him a glass of warm milk. He drinks it, lays down, falls asleep. Jael then takes a tent peg and drives it right through his temple, through his head, into the ground. And so he died on the spot there. This enemy was killed by a woman driving a tent peg. In the same way that the dagger went all the way through the guy, out the back, the tent peg went all the way through his head and came out the back. God is accomplishing big victories in the book of Judges with small things. Another small thing in Judges is the story of Samson, where Samson, he took a jawbone of a donkey. I tried to buy a jawbone of a donkey online, and I couldn't. So I had to make my own out of wood. But there's a story where Samson killed hundreds of Philistines just by grabbing a bone and whacking on these Philistines and killing the enemies of God with just a jawbone. I'm sure finally the jawbone just gave out. But that's all he had. He didn't even have a sword to use. God can do big things, class, through very small means. Another way that Samson defeated the enemy with small things is he trapped 300 foxes, and he tied between their tails lit torches, and then he sent these foxes loose in the Philistines' grain, and it burned down all their grain. So that's their food supply. When you're fighting a war, you want to cut off their food. You want to cut off their war material. You want to disrupt their lines of communication. That's what these judges do in the book of Judges. But Samson's doing it with just some animals who, unfortunately, I'm sure the animals perished in that scene, but it's what God did was small things to get things done. No doubt you've heard of another small thing, and I try to picture it this way with a little army. These are some little army men in a theater of battle. And you've probably heard the story of Gideon, where Gideon had like 32,000 Jewish people show up to fight against 135,000 Midianites. God said, that's too many people. And so 20,000 just go home. Well, now he's got 10,000 Jews against 135,000 Midianites. God said, that's still too many. I don't need that many. So through a test of drinking water, it ends up being 300 Jews on the Israel side fighting 135,000 Midianites. Just a small army. And if you know this story, you need to read this in the book of Judges. But Gideon's men, they surround the Midianites in their camp, and then they pull these torches out from under clay pots. They blow trumpets, make a bunch of noise. You got 300 people surrounding the Midianites. Midianites got all confused. Confusion by God came to them, and they ended up killing each other. And no Jew ever had to raise a sword. They didn't have any swords. All they had was Ehud with his ramshackle, bloody dagger. So you see, God does big things with small things. And another story is a woman who took an upper millstone, a big heavy stone, and there was an enemy of the Jews at the bottom of this tower, and she took this millstone and she dropped it on Abimelech's head, and it busted his head clean open, and he died because a woman dropped a rock. When we get into 1 Samuel, there's another day of small things, and it's another rock, and that's David using a smooth stone to kill Goliath. David, they only had one piece of armor, one set of armor in the entire Jewish army, and it was for Saul, the first king. It's not like, David tried it on, it didn't fit. They had to use a can opener to get him out of that thing. But it's not like they could say, oh, we need a smaller size piece of armor for David to go fight Goliath. They didn't have any armor. David said, I don't need that. All I need is a rock. I spend 18 hours a day as a shepherd boy throwing rocks, so I know what I'm doing. And so he throws that stone with his sling. It goes into Goliath's head, and it's stuck in his head. Just like the dagger stayed in the guy, like the tent peg stayed in that guy's head, now we got a stone sinking into Goliath's brain, and naturally he dies. So it's the day of small things. Sin, servitude, supplication, salvation. Ehud with the bloody dagger. Gideon with the small army. God can accomplish much, even though we sometimes feel like we bring very little. I mean, I don't have great wealth. I don't have a TV show. I don't run some big ministry. But the few things I do have, I can use for the Lord. Okay, we get into Ruth. Ruth is the hinge. I call Ruth the lovers in the lineage. This is a love story. This is boy meets girl. This is Ruth, the Moabitess woman, going with her mother back to the Holy Land. They go back to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, the city of David. And they're out in the fields, and she meets Boaz out in the wheat fields outside of Bethlehem, which is interesting because later on Jesus will be born in Bethlehem, and there will be shepherds out in those fields watching their flocks, right? Same location we're talking about here. And so Ruth and Boaz meet, they have dinner and a movie, they spend time together, they fall in love, and they end up getting married. But the key purpose of Ruth is that it comes at the end of the period of the Judges. You go Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Ruth isn't just stuck there for any reason. It's there for a very specific reason, to provide a lineage to get to David. Because the very last words in the book of Ruth in chapter 4 is, it shows they begat, Ruth and Boaz begat Obed, and then finally Jesse is born. Jesse's the father of David, and then bingo, the book ends. So Ruth is the lovers and the lineage, leading all the way to 1 Samuel and that first king in Israel. Now in 1 Samuel, okay, we're doing rapid survey here, class. The last judge to the first king. We're going to establish a monarchy in Israel. Because at the end of Judges, it says in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So it's just begging for a king. And so the people are going to want a king. And they're going to want desperately to have a king. And I want to read for you the anointing of David here in 1 Samuel 16:7. I consider this the key verse of the book. But Samuel is going to find out who's going to be the first king in Israel, or the king to come actually after King Saul. He's gone to the house of Jesse, and they're checking out all these handsome older brothers, and finally they're going to bring David out. And it says in 1 Samuel 16:7, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. That is, Eliab, the eldest, he's not going to be the next king of Israel. I rejected him. God does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, the Lord looks at the heart. I see that as the key verse of the book, as David is going to be called the man after God's own heart. A lot of application there. Students, it matters more who you are on the inside than what you look like on the outside. 1 Samuel 16:7. In 1 Samuel, we have three main figures. Samuel is the prophet judge. Saul is going to be the first king. David is the shepherd. He's not going to become king until 2 Samuel. But in 1 Samuel, we have the birth of Samuel, and he's born, and he's going to be raised in the temple there with Eli. Samuel is going to fight wars with the Philistines. And basically, one of the hard things that happens in 1 Samuel is the Ark of the Covenant. You know, God lived on top of that box, the Ark of the Covenant. It was stolen by the Philistines in battle. And so the Philistines got the Ark of the Covenant. You've got to read this story in chapter 5. The Philistines take the Ark and they put it in their God chamber, and Dagon, their god, falls over, all by itself, falls over. It's prostrate before the Ark of the Covenant, as if giving obeisance or submission to God. And then there's tumors, and there's death, and rats, and all kinds of things happen. It does not go well with the Philistines when they have the Ark of the Covenant. So that's kind of the decay of Israel, though. The Ark is taken away. Eli dies. The priest Eli dies. And then there's the birth of a little boy named Ichabod. The glory is departed. Okay? Ichabod is what that means in the Hebrew. So the people go, okay, Israel's falling apart. We need a king. And Samuel, you're too old to rule. Samuel, your sons are too perverted. And we want a God with skin on it. We want a leader with skin on it because God doesn't have skin. He's invisible. And so Saul is chosen as the first king. And it's the wrong motive. They want to be like the other nations. It's the wrong criterion. Saul was handsome. And the wrong tribe. Saul was a Benjamite, not a Judahite. Because it said in the end of Genesis, Shiloh is going to come through Judah. Judah is going to be the seed of Israel. So Saul does some foolish things. Then he's anointed as king, but he sacrifices a burnt offering, does a foolish vow. I mean, Saul, when you think about Saul, nobody could have had a better start. He was handsome. He took the initiative. He was brave in battle. He was spirit-filled, according to 1 Samuel 11. But then what happened is he fell into pride, rebellion, recklessness, and then ultimately God gave him a demon. He became demon-possessed. And then David is going to be anointed as the next king. David's going to defeat Goliath with that stone, single combat, the best Jew against the best Philistine, winner take all, and David accomplishes that. Then in the rest of 1 Samuel, David is going to be protected in a lot of different ways. By marrying Michal, he's going to be lowered from a window, and he's going to go over to the Gathites and Philistines and kind of pretend to be insane so he can be protected by Achish, king of Gath. It's probably when he was there, he stole the metal technology from the Philistines and brought it back to the Jews. That may have been something David did while he was in captivity there. But some lessons from 1 Samuel. There's no limit to how bad and evil a jealous person can become. Because most of 1 Samuel, at least the last part, is 13 years of Saul chasing David all over the countryside in a jealous rampage trying to kill David. 2 Samuel, David comes to power. Saul has died on Mount Gilboa in 1 Samuel 21, and now David's going to reign as king. And there's going to be a little fighting there with Saul's dynasty, and there's going to be a long war between the houses of Saul and David. And David's arrow is going to be going up, and Saul's arrow is going down. It's like a juxtaposition in this book. So David's going to take the throne. He's going to capture Jerusalem from the Jebusites. He's going to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and then he receives the Davidic covenant. You got to read 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 to 14. Can't read it now, but you got to read this thing. There's a house, a throne, and a kingdom promised to Israel, and that predicts the coming of Jesus Christ. David falls into sin. I mean, he gets all this great stuff. He gets everything going. He picks up extra wives, has a lot of kids, maybe 5 or 6 wives by this point, which I don't condone that. You know, guys, don't emulate that, but that's just what David did here. But David then becomes lustful toward Bathsheba, and that's in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. And we'll close this little session by reading this part, because David clearly has become idle at this point. He's at midlife. He's probably about 47 years old. It says it happened in the spring. This is 2 Samuel chapter 11. At the time when the kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants and all Israel, and they went out to fight. But David stayed at Jerusalem. He stayed. He shouldn't have been idle and foolish. He should have been out fighting the battles. But David's going to have two main sins: lust, which led to adultery with Bathsheba, and then premeditated murder, which led to the death of Uriah, who's Bathsheba's husband. But there's three simple sentences here. He saw a woman bathing. Of course, we always see things with our eyes. We see things that, wow, that's, I don't want to do that. That's not right. He saw, and then he sent and inquired. And then in verse 4, David sent messengers and took her. And he lay with her. Now, he saw her taking a bath, right? She had no clothes on. The Hebrew there indicates she was doing a ceremonial cleansing, some kind of ritual from the Old Testament. Maybe she just had her menstrual period or something. So she was obeying God by taking a bath, and that amplifies David's sin. Then after David lay with her, it says, when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she takes a second bath. Because by Levitical law, if a woman has had sexual intercourse, she has to take a bath to be ceremonially clean. So here's a woman who's taking two baths, obeying the laws of Leviticus, walking with God, and then you got David dragging her into all this adultery and murder and things like that. So he saw, he sent, and he took. Well, David's going to pay a heavy price here as we close this out. The consequences of his sin. He's going to survive this. He's an adulterer. He should have been put to death. We read that in Leviticus 20. If you commit adultery, you get the death penalty. Well, he got off the hook, and his child died in his place. That baby who was born to Bathsheba died as a payment for David's sin. And then his daughter Tamar gets raped, and then Amnon, one of his sons, gets killed, and then Absalom revolts and runs David out of town. I mean, it's just a disaster. And so, David is a guy, man after God's own heart, yes. He had it on the inside, but he didn't finish well. It's just unfortunate. He did so many good things in his life, but he didn't finish well. To me, that's the abiding lesson of 2 Samuel is, a lot of you are young in life. I don't know where you're at in your life now, but I'm 55 years old at the point of making this video. I got a lot of life ahead of me. I want to finish well. It's not the time to deteriorate. We all need to finish well. Amen.